Goes down into and produces subatomic particles, which are the next phase of the process. And the protons and so forth have densified, and they have trapped light within these particles. And subatomic particles now have 2 degrees of freedom, 1 degree of constraint. So the fall has to do with this loss of freedom. As we get down to the Newtonian world, there'll be this, he's sort of constructing the great chain of being to get to the Newton world, where everything was absolutely deterministic. But then in the living world, there'll be this return back to freedom. So we have the particles of subatomic particles, then you have atoms come in, and they trap the subatomic particles within the atoms, and then you have sort of 1 degree of, or rather 3 degrees, what is it, 3, 2, 1, sorry, and then 0, 1, 2. 1 degree of freedom, 2 degrees of constraint. And then finally we get the inverse of what we had before. At the molecular level, we have absolute capture, a total loss of freedom. And this is why the laws of classical physics are completely deterministic. Matter at the macro level, at the level of planets and stars and suns and galaxies, the sandwich world that we're living in now, does appear to be absolutely deterministic, determined by the laws of causality, determined by the laws of science, because you have these large aggregations that have built up from these other kingdoms, and they become more and more trapped, the more bonded they become in the world of molecules and molecular combinations. So that's the 4th level. Then we get to the 5th level, where we begin to get now the reverse of this, which is simply the same in mirror image. Now we begin to get back the 1 degree of freedom with plants. Plants have 1 degree of freedom, 2 degrees of constraint. They are re-achieving the same freedom that atoms had. And the reason that is so has to do with a concept that Jung develops called about symmetry. We'll see that just in a second, though. That's 5. And then 6, we have animals, of course. And you know where this is going with 7. The kingdom, instead of calling it the human kingdom, he calls it dominion, and says that really the human is a subset of the dominion kingdom. We'll put human here. So, and then these are the mirror image of those. Animals have 2 degrees of freedom, 1 degree of constraint, and the human being has recaptured the initial freedom of light, 3 degrees of freedom, 0 degrees of constraint. So that it is through the transformation of human consciousness that light regains its initial freedom. And indeed, in all the great religious traditions of the world, we have the spiritual process characterized as an illumination, an infection of the consciousness with light. If you look, for example, at the Hindu model of Jainism, where the soul is this jiva, this monad of light that has become infected with karma, and the idea is to get the karma out of the jiva through stopping doing anything. Anything you do in the Jain system generates karma. Good or bad, karma is bad. You don't want to generate any karma whatsoever. You eat a fruit, you're generating karma. It doesn't blacken the monad with the same dark colors, but it still gives it color. And what you want to do is get it back to that crystalline white purity. And the only way you can do that in the Jain system is by doing nothing. Eventually you have to starve yourself. So as you can imagine, it's not a very popular religion, but it's still around in the world today. That's the odd thing. And the other odd thing is that most of the Jains are bankers.
Bankers?
In India.
How does that work?
I'm not sure. Yeah, they're Hindu bankers.
And there's no karma in that?
Yeah. Oh, sure there is. Yes.
I would think.
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, it's funny.
But the idea is that all universally through the world, the spiritual consciousness has to do with this getting the darkness out. Whether it's characterized as karma, whether it's characterized as matter, the darkness has to be gotten out. And the Buddha rejected the Jains as absolutely ridiculous, having this literalistic emphasis on having to starve yourself to death. That's what, when he went out and practiced with yogis, he began to realize, I don't need to starve myself to attain illumination. That's just silly. All you need to do is attain a certain psychological stance that centers you within. It doesn't make any difference what your what you're doing in terms of these karmic activities. You just have to have that center, that nirvanic center that will disengage you from consciously from the sufferings of the world. So that's Arthur Young's the first aspect of his model. Now, the way in which the freedom and constraint relationship works has to do with symmetry, and neither the human consciousness nor light has any symmetry whatsoever. This is what he says. Particles and animals both have bilateral symmetry, and this is why they have 2 degrees of freedom. There's a certain, the 2 degrees of freedom that subatomic particles have has to do with the uncertainty of position and the uncertainty principle of Heisenberg, the uncertainty of position and velocity. There's also a certain ambiguity in terms of where the animal's going to turn up. It has 2 degrees of freedom and uncertainty with respect to position and velocity. It can turn up anywhere. It's got this freedom to move about through space. And this bilateral symmetry is something that animals share in common with subatomic particles. Whereas atoms and plants share in common radial symmetry. And this is why they're more stuck in place. If you look at an atom sort of, from the top down, you see the central nucleus with all in the classical model, with all the whirling electrons. It has a radial symmetry. If you look down at a flower, it's got the same radial symmetry that atoms have. So you have this 1 degree of freedom and 2 degrees of constraint. Both plants and atoms are similarly in a state of bondage, but with a certain amount of freedom. Here at the molecular level, you just have complete symmetry, what's called total symmetry. It's like a frozen lattice that's captured matter to a state where it can't move around at all. This is the sort of mineral world, the world, the periodic table of the elements, the chemicals. Now, when we move into Arthur Young's graph in a second here, because he maps this out in a way also that will look like the periodic table of the elements, but will shed new light on each one of these. He also subdivides these into 4 different levels. So you have 4 levels, 7 stages. And there's a certain asymmetry here because this level is involuntary. Everything happens here in an involuntary way. This half is voluntary. So you have a certain asymmetry between the 2 halves. There's a voluntary, involuntary. Light sort of projects the goal, and human consciousness attains the goal. The particle moves by a charge, and animals also move by a certain kind of energy charge. And then atoms sort of spin off copies of themselves, seed forms, you might say, just as plants give off seeds. Atoms represent the centering principle, giving off centers. And plants also sort of give off centers as these seed copies that are reproductions of themselves. So, in a certain sense, then, what we have are these stages of consciousness in terms of those 7 levels. And the symmetries. Okay. Has everybody got this model? So both Arthur Young and Rudolf Steiner are coming out of this sort of Gnostic stream. They have a lot of things in common with each other. And then just to familiarize you with the names that he gives a certain power to each of those 7 levels. That you need to abstract the power from the level because they're going to reiterate on each one of those levels. So each one of those levels will reiterate the structure of the whole. Potential, light is the kingdom of potentiality. So that's going to be the potential kingdom. Binding is the 2nd level. You begin to have light is bonded into the proton. And then identity. Atoms begin to form the sense of identity, of a centering structure. And then combination at the molecular level. Growth, the principle of growth at the plant level. The principle of mobility at the animal level. And the principle, once again, just of dominion, what he calls dominion, at the human level. And we'll see how each one of these levels, with the exception of subatomic particles, reiterates this.